Welcome to a new day of truth and awakening. And thank you all for tuning in to the first edition of History versus the Bible. I am your King and Royal Majesty, Pharaoh Mitzrahim, historical researcher, geographer, and the voice of truth. And today I will be teaching on the subject, did the Israelites enslave the Egyptians in Egypt? History versus the Bible. But before we get started, be sure to look below, subscribe to this channel, comment, like, and share. Thank you. When it comes to the biblical Exodus, the Bible states that the Hebrew Israelites came into Egypt, settled in Egypt, grew as a population, became slaves to the Egyptians, and later, under the leadership of a man named Moses, fled out of Egypt and escaped slavery. But what if I told you there's another side to this story, a historical side coming from the Egyptians themselves that says otherwise? And the truth of this matter is found only in the ancient written historical records. So without further ado, let's show the source, examine it, analyze it, and find out the truth about who enslaved who in Egypt during the time of the Exodus. No more waiting for the truth. Let us now begin our lesson and get straight to the point as we start at Genesis chapter 46 verse 6, and it says in quotes, "And they took their cattle and their goods which they had gotten in the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt, Jacob and all his seed with him." Genesis chapter 47 verse 1, "Then Joseph came and told Pharaoh and said, My father and my brethren and their flocks and their herds and all that they have are come out of the land of Canaan, and behold, they are in the land of Goshen." Genesis chapter 47 verse 2, "And he took some of his brethren, even 5 men, and presented them unto Pharaoh." Genesis chapter 47 verse 3, "And Pharaoh said unto his brethren, What is your occupation? And they said unto Pharaoh, Thy servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers." Based on what we just read in the book of Genesis chapter 46 and chapter 47, Jacob or Israel and all his children that came into the land of Egypt were known as shepherds. And as we move along, let us keep in mind and stay focused on this key word, shepherd. And this is what the Bible says about Jacob and the children of Israel that came into the land of Egypt. But let us move on. Let us now go to Exodus chapter 1 verse 1, and it says in quote, "Now these are the names of the children of Israel, which came into Egypt. Every man in his household came with Jacob." Exodus chapter 1 verse 7, "And the children of Israel were fruitful, and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them." Exodus chapter 1 verse 11, "Therefore did they set over them taskmasters, to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses." Exodus chapter 1 verse 13, "And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor." Exodus chapter 1 verse 14, "And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor." According to what we just read, the book of Exodus chapter 1 stated, the children of Israel, or the Israelites who were in Egypt, were fruitful, prosperous, increased abundantly, and grew as a mighty population, and later had taskmasters or slave masters set over them to afflict them, enslave them, put them in hard bondage, and became slaves to the Egyptians. And this is according to the book of Exodus in the Bible. Let us now turn to the book of Exodus chapter 13 verse 18, and it says in quote, "But God led the people about through the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up harnessed out of the land of Egypt." Exodus chapter 14 verse 22. And the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea upon the dry ground, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. Exodus chapter 14 verse 23. And the Egyptians pursued, and went in after them to the midst of the sea, even all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. Exodus chapter 14 verse 27. And Moses stretched forth his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to his strength when the morning appeared, and the Egyptians fled against it, and the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. Exodus chapter 14 verse 30. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore. Based on the passage we just read, the book of Exodus chapter 14 states, the children of Israel, led by Moses, fled out of Egypt. And while being chased and pursued by the Egyptians, the Lord kills the Egyptians and thus saves Israel from the Egyptians. And Israel escapes slavery. And this is according to the Bible. Let us now go to history and see what the Egyptians themselves had to say. And being that the word history was coined and introduced by the one and only ancient Greek historian Herodotus, we will start with the writings of Herodotus. And Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the year 450 BCE, talked to and conversed with the Egyptians and wrote it down in his books titled The Histories. And in his books, Herodotus The Histories, Book 2, Chapter 128, translated by G.C. Macaulay, says in quote, "Here then they reckon 106 years, during which they say there was nothing but evil for the Egyptians, and the temples were kept closed and not open during all that time. These kings, the Egyptians, by reason of their hatred of them, are not willing to name. Nay, they even call the pyramids after the name of Philetus, the shepherd, who at that time pastured flocks in those regions." As we just read G.C. Macaulay's translation of Herodotus, I'm going to show my very own translation for the first part of the text, so that we can find out what's being said in the original Greek language. And here's according to the Greek in quote, "Tauta laudizante hekaton kai ek atia in aigitios ianai paran kekokita." And here's the English translation for this, in quotes, "They reckon 106 years and Egypt was all evil." The key words used in the text by Herodotus are kekotita or kekos, meaning evil or wickedness, and poi minos, meaning shepherd or herdsman. According to what we just read, Herodotus stated, the land of Egypt, when it was ruled and inhabited by the shepherds, was filled with evil and wickedness. But we also learn Herodotus confused the age of the pyramids with the shepherd rule in Egypt. But we know today the pyramids predate the shepherd rule in Egypt. But still, thanks to Herodotus, we now know Egypt, when it was ruled by the shepherds, was in its worst condition and was filled with evil and wickedness. And this is according to Herodotus. For our next source of history, we will go to Manetho, a native Egyptian historian who lived during the 3rd century BCE. And he wrote a book about the history of his own country, Egypt, known as Egyptica. And in Egyptica, Manetho states in quote, "Timaeus in his reign, for what cause I know not, a blast of God smote us, and unexpectedly from the regions of the east, invaders of obscure race marched in confidence of victory against our land. By main force, they easily overpowered the rulers of the land. They then burnt our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods, and treated all the natives with a cruel hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others.
Then they made one of their own king. His name was Salatis. These 6 were their first kings. They all along waged war against the Egyptians and wanted to destroy them to the very roots. These people, whom we have called kings before, and shepherds too, and their descendants, as he says, held Egypt for 511 years. Then he says, the kings of Thebes and other parts of Egypt rose against the shepherds, and a long and terrible war was fought between them. He says further, by a king named Alisrag-Mudosis, the shepherds were subdued and were driven out of the most parts of Egypt and shut up in a place named Avaris. Thutmose, son of Alisrag-Mudosis, attempted to take the city by force and by siege, with 480,000 men surrounding it. But he despaired of taking the place by siege and concluded a treaty with them that they should leave Egypt and go without any harm coming to them, wherever they wished. After the conclusion of the treaty, they left with their families and chattels, not fewer than 240,000 people, and crossed the desert into Syria. This whole nation was styled Hyksos, that is, shepherd kings, for the first syllable Hyk, according to the sacred dialect, denotes a king, as is Sos, a shepherd. According to the passage we just read, Manetho states, an obscure race of invaders from Asia in the east, known as shepherds, came into Egypt, conquered Egypt, destroyed the cities and temples in Egypt, killed and massacred the native Egyptians, enslaved the women and children, and wanted to destroy the Egyptians to the very roots. But later on, a brave and noble family of black native Egyptian kings in southern Egypt, being fed up with the oppression of their people, decided to stir up a revolt, and thus united the forces, attacked the shepherds, defeated the shepherds, expelled the shepherds out of Egypt, and therefore freed their people from the yoke of slavery. And this is according to Manetho. And concerning those 2 brave warrior kings mentioned in the writings of Manetho as Alisrag-Mudosis and Thutmose, are known in the sacred writings of Kemet as King Kamos and Amos of the 17th dynasty. And fortunately, we have surviving primary records in their own writings mentioning their victory against the shepherds. And here in the stele of Kamos of the 17th dynasty, he says in quotes, I will sail north to engage the Asiatics, and success will come. The enduring king Wajeh Kepura, son of Ra, Kamos the mighty, given life, who subdued the south and drove back the north, who seized the land by main force.
So there it is. When the source is brought forth, the truth comes out. And when the source is present, the truth cannot be denied. And truth is, the other side of the story has spoken. And according to history, the Egyptians, the Africans, were not the villains and slave masters as the Bible portrayed them as. But truth is, the Egyptians were actually the slaves being oppressed by these people called shepherds, known in the Bible as the children of Israel, the people of the book. Now, doesn't this sound familiar? Like once upon a time when the Christian Bible followers of the Abrahamic faith enslaved Africans right here in America under the laws of the Bible, the same Bible that says, obey your slave master, the same Bible that cursed the Africans in their first book called Genesis, and the same Bible that changed the story and demonized Africans as slave masters in their book called Exodus. But thanks to history, we now know the truth. and the truth shall set us free. And with that said, I arrest my case.
So there you have it. What did we learn today? We learned that the biblical Hebrew Israelites and the historical Hyksos shepherds were one and the same people. And we also learned that there are two conflicting sides of the story referring to the same event. One side of the story, which is the Bible in the Hebrews, is saying the Israelites came into Egypt, became slaves to the Egyptians, fled out of Egypt, and escaped slavery. But the other side of the story, which is history and the Egyptians, is saying no. The Bible and the Hebrews have it all wrong, and the Bible has reversed the story. But truth is, it was the shepherds or Israelites that came into Egypt, conquered Egypt, ruled Egypt, enslaved the Egyptians, and later the Egyptians united, rebelled, defeated the oppressors, ran the shepherds out of Egypt, and freed themselves from slavery. And that is the truth of this matter. But even more interesting is the belief held amongst many African Americans today. The belief as African Americans, we identify as the Hebrew Israelites. Because just as the Hebrew Israelites were slaves in Egypt, our ancestors were slaves in America. And my response to that is, as African Americans, we identify as the Egyptians. Because just like the Egyptians, our ancestors were Africans. And now we know, according to history, it was the Egyptians, the Africans, who were slaves in their own land. And it was the Egyptians, the Africans, who united, rebelled, defeated their oppressors, and freed themselves from slavery. And as an African, and as a rightful bloodline descendant of the ancient Egyptians, I'm going with what the ancient Egyptians say. And to answer the question, did the Israelites enslave the Egyptians in Egypt? The answer is yes, because the truth is in the history. And with that said, this is your brother Pharaoh Mitzrayim signing out, saying, until next time, Egypt stays in Africa. Peace, Ma'at, Hotep, and may you all have a wonderful day.